Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to take a look at the state of the oceans to see what can be done to make them cleaner and to make them more sustainable over the long haul. And we have a guest today who's very knowledgeable in this area. Mr. Andrew Hudson heads the United Nations Development Program's Water and Ocean Governance Program in its Bureau for Policy and Program Support. Prior to joining the United Nations Development Program, Mr. Hudson was Executive Director of the Center for Field Research at Earthwatch. Andy Hudson, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill. It's great to be here.
Good to have you back because the oceans they're really under stress. I think that's a mild understatement, and we really need to focus on them. And we've done this before in the past, and we're going to do it again today. But again, welcome. And before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about the United Nations Development Program, commonly called UNDP. Basically, briefly, what does it do?
So UNDP is sort of the UN system, obviously, agency focused on the development agenda, but that particularly means poverty reduction. And so UNDP takes a number of approaches to enabling reduction of poverty, creation of livelihoods, and sustainable development, focusing on gender, social inclusion, equity, governance, and of course environment. You cannot develop sustainably or develop at all without a healthy and functioning environment. So a big focus of our work, and including my work, is on maintaining a healthy environment for development.
And our viewers can go to your website at undp.org to get more information.
Yep.
And now your office is the Water and Ocean Governance Program. What does that particular entity do?
So yeah, my piece of the equation, we focus on helping governments, UNDP beneficiary countries, with enhancing their management of both freshwater and marine ecosystems. So we work in river basins, lakes, underground water systems, groundwater systems, and then a lot in the marine systems, coral reefs, mangroves, seagrasses, and what are called large marine ecosystems, these large shared oceans of water where much of the economic activity and the biological activity in the ocean occurs. So we're helping them. These are very long-range programs working on policy reform, regulatory reform, institutions, investment identification, all toward moving these systems towards sustainable use.
Now, before the program, you were telling me about a very interesting oceans initiative that you had, an innovation program, I think is what it was. What exactly is that?
Yeah, so about 2 months ago, today in fact, we launched this called the Ocean Innovation Challenge, and basically inviting stakeholders from pretty much all walks of life, from the private sector to nonprofits to academia and others, to come up with really great ideas for ocean. This is focusing on SDG 14.1, which is the pollution, marine pollution SDG, and basically looking for not only technological, but policy, regulatory, economic, financial ideas, solutions for these issues. And so we were quite pleased to learn today's, in fact, by coincidence, the deadline for submission
for
applications. And as of today, we have 500 applications or submissions of interest. So it's very exciting to we'll be starting to go through those and see what kind of amazing ideas are out there.
That seems like a nice large number to me anyway.
It is a very large number.
It was very good. And now you get to read all of them.
Right.
Okay, good luck on that.
Thank you.
And let's see, your website is undp.org/water.
Right.
So the viewers can go to that.
Yep.
Yeah, we've heard really since, I guess, 1988, when the United Nations set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they've done now, I forget, 5 or 6 major studies. In fact, the UN has been the epicenter to a large degree, not by itself, but other groups have been involved too, focusing the world attention on climate change, global warming, and the deterioration of our planet. And of course, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has come up with several reports indicating that we have a very short time span to get a handle on this climate change issue. How are we doing in the ocean area? You mentioned Sustainable Development Goal number 14, focusing on clean water, oceans, and that type of thing. How are we doing? Just a ballpark figure.
So, you could start, for example, the ocean economy. That is the goods and services that we depend on from the ocean, everything from fisheries, coastal tourism, aquaculture, shipping, and so forth. It's on the order, we've done estimates, others, say $2 to $3 trillion a year. So it's a big piece of the global economy. And even probably more important, several hundred million, 300-400 million people depend on healthy oceans for their livelihoods, whether they're fishers and so forth. So, with all the known threats that we already were facing, pollution, overfishing, habitat loss, invasive species, climate change, in the last really 30, 40, 50 years has really emerged in some ways as the most dominant and pressing threat to the oceans. It's fair to say. And the reasons for that are pretty simple. It's the so-called triple threat of climate to the oceans. And that is obviously warming. The oceans have warmed significantly in this era of anthropogenic climate change, number one. Number two, what is known as ocean acidification, the fact that about 30% of the carbon dioxide we burn into the air every year dissolves into the ocean, and that causes a phenomenon which is very well understood called ocean acidification. The ocean is becoming more acidic, and that has great, potentially dramatic negative consequences for not only species and populations of organisms, but even whole ecosystems. So that's a big deal. And then the last one, or last two really, are ocean deoxygenation, that is losing oxygen. Because no big surprise, simple chemistry, a warmer ocean holds less oxygen, holds less gas. And so we're already seeing 1, 2, 3% reduction in oxygen and increase in so-called low oxygen areas or hypoxic areas in the ocean, in part driven by climate change. So these are kind of the triple threat, deoxygenation, warming, and acidification to the oceans, each tying into very important socioeconomic and other needs.
And a lot of the meteorologists and the scientists now are pointing to this warming, just taking one of those four that you mentioned, the warming of the oceans is one of the major reasons for the increase in the frequency and intensity and the violence of many of these hurricanes and cyclones. And we're seeing, it seems like we're seeing more of them, and they're more devastating than they were maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago. But that ties right into the warming, does it not?
Right, and it's even better in some ways to look at climate change not just as global warming or ocean warming, but it's really Earth system disruption in terms of energy. There's basically much more energy being captured in the Earth system, both the ocean and the atmosphere, that is exactly speeding up atmospheric processes, hydrological processes, the hydrological cycle, how water turns over. So exactly, you're seeing more intense events, hurricanes, tornadoes, and so forth. If you look at the numbers, the ocean itself has absorbed roughly 90% of the additional excess heat in the entire Earth system, not the atmosphere. The atmosphere has 10%. Ocean has 90% of it. So the ocean has, in many ways, saved us, but unfortunately been the victim. If that ocean hadn't taken in that 90%, it'd be in the atmosphere. It'd be 10 degrees centigrade warmer now, not just one. So the ocean, but as I said, the ocean is very much a victim of climate change. And really that's just starting to be acknowledged. The last COP, climate change COP in Madrid, was designated as the oceans COP. So a lot more attention was brought to the ocean aspect of climate change, as it needs to be.
And these international conferences have been so important to bring hopefully the leaders of the world, the governments, the private sector, non-governmental organizations, everybody together to focus on this problem. And this, it sounds, you mentioned 10 degrees, and to many of us we think, well, 10 degrees is not much. 10 degrees when it comes to your planet or with your oceans,
right,
that's
centigrade.
Centigrade makes it even worse, right? That's a huge bump as far as the heat and the intensity. And what can we do? I know there's so many things. First off, we need to get off fossil fuels. I think most people are in agreement. That's causing a large part of our problem. Get off coal, gas, whatever, anything that's got a fossil base to it, to get off that, to go with clean energy, green energy. But what can we do to help the oceans?
So, in climate change, and the good news you could say is the Paris Agreement of 2015, which called for the world to reduce CO2 emissions, I think it's by 45% by 2030, which would in principle keep us within the so-called 1.5 degree C net increase since pre-industrial times limit. And obviously there's a huge earnest effort on many, many levels by UNDP, by many partners, by governments towards the Paris Agreement. And the good news is as we make progress on Paris and in reducing CO2 emissions from all those sectors, it helps the ocean too. The ocean will warm less, correspondingly less. The ocean will acidify correspondingly less. The ocean will deoxygenate correspondingly less. So, it all ties in very closely. How the climate behaves in response to our action on climate change is very much mirrored by how the ocean will behave in the positive sense.
And we mentioned conferences a minute ago. Again, going back, the UN's been doing these major conferences since about 1972. They started focusing attention on sustainability,
right.
Well, really in 1992 at the Rio Conference, but it was really in 1992 at the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, UNCED,
right.
in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, that they really started the ball rolling talking about sustainability, and they've kept this going over the years. And I know the current Secretary General, by his actions, we can all see that Antonio Guterres is certainly intent on this. Ban Ki-moon, when he was Secretary General, certainly. In fact, he saved a conference or two that was on the verge of going belly up, and he got involved in it. So the UN has really played a key role. But there's one conference coming up June 3rd to the 5th in Lisbon, Portugal, Oceans Conference, assuming that the coronavirus doesn't have it canceled or something between now and then. But what would you like to see come out of that conference?
So that's the next of a first conference that was held here in New York, 2017 Ocean Conference. That was co-hosted by Fiji and Sweden. The Portugal conference is co-hosted by Portugal and Kenya, hosted by Portugal, of course. And so a similar approach to bring high-level government, intergovernmental, United Nations, NGOs, private sector, the ODA community, et cetera, together, and to, in the same way as in 2017, try to build up overall case for action on the ocean. There'll be some kind of broad statement that will be issued toward the end of the conference, and in particular, this continuation of a really outstanding feature of the 2017 conference, which was something called the Voluntary Commitments Platform, which the UN set up, which basically invited stakeholders at all levels, from the smallest NGO to the largest company or government, to put together and submit specific commitments that would address one or more of the SDG 14 Oceans targets, whether it might be pollution, overfishing. And we were all really quite excited and pleased in the end. After that 2017 conference, there were over 1,400 of these commitments, and that was a quite remarkable success. So the hope is that this momentum would continue in this next conference. The commitment registry is open still for this process. And of course, the individual who's been quite strong behind all this, Peter Thompson. He was the ambassador to Fiji at the time, and the chair of the General Assembly, the PGA. And so he really, as a co-sponsor, he really pushed that conference. He was then, of course, post 2017 conference, designated by the Secretary General as the UN Special Envoy for Oceans. So Peter has literally been running around the planet, advocating, pushing, bringing people together, bringing entities together on the oceans agenda. So that's been a really important development.
And if our viewers, put in a shameless plug, if our viewers would like to hear what he has to say about it, they can go to our website and look at it, because he's been on the program twice now. So it does an excellent job.
He's amazing.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would encourage our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a computer, you have a website, you like our shows, you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're taking a look at the oceans and what we can do to make them more sustainable and to make sure that we don't pollute them for future generations. My guest is an expert in this area. Mr. Andrew Hudson is the head of the United Nations Development Program's Water and Ocean Governance Program. Andy, you mentioned several things a moment ago. We'll get to them now. Hopefully we'll have time to jump into them. Overfishing, with the burgeoning population, with the increased demand, the desire for more fish products and what have you. We see that the oceans are being overfished quite dramatically. Is that the case? And what can we do to maybe reverse that? Because we do need fish, and aquaculture may be an answer, I don't know, or part of an answer.
Right. So kind of the big picture story, roughly since the early 80s, the catch of wild fish in the oceans has been pretty much flat at about 80 million metric tons per year. And as you mentioned, aquaculture, I mean, if it wasn't for the dramatic, say, 7% annual compounded growth over those same 30 or 40 years of aquaculture production, we wouldn't definitely have as much seafood and aquatic protein to eat. And in fact, these days, I think it's about 46 and 54% are the proportion that is wild caught and is aquaculture. So that's the good news. We have caught up. But again, because of this overfishing phenomenon, roughly 30% of fish stocks most recently have been considered to be overfished or depleted or even collapsed. Maybe 60% exploited sustainably, and then maybe only 10% underexploited, so to speak. So there's obviously not much room for growth, so the aquaculture. But the good news is there's been a lot of really exciting initiatives on a whole range of things. For example, the work of Global Fishing Watch and similar organizations improving the capacity of both enforcement authorities, but also really the public, because these databases are public, to see what fishing vessels are doing in real time and to identify where they may be cheating, fishing where they're not supposed to fish, fishing when they're not supposed to fish, and so forth. So there's some very important developments there. The FAO, through its member states, adopted something a few years ago called the Port State Measures Agreement, which requires the states where fishermen might bring their catch into to meet certain obligations in terms of the legitimacy and so forth of the fish being caught. And for example, there's a big push for what's known as improving traceability in the whole supply chain of fisheries, from the day it's caught on the vessel to where it's unloaded on a port, going into various transport to its ultimate point of sale, and trying to actually move it towards where a customer can actually say, oh, this fish was bought caught on September 3rd, 2014, and whatever, to really provide a lot more legitimacy and integrity, you could say. Because fisheries also is a victim of a lot of corruption, of subsidies. There's something like $16 billion a year in negative subsidies, that is subsidies that promote overfishing, and that's still a huge issue under the WTO, which is undergoing discussions continued. So there's a number of nuts to crack, but the good news is there's a lot of attention, a lot of focus on this in general in the world.
And when you say corruption, are you talking about fishing companies like the big trawlers or whatever, they pay off their governments, or they bring in more illegal catches?
Yeah, it can be bribes, it can be illegal fishing. What's often called IUU, illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing, which is something like 30% of all fishing. Really? So worth about $28 billion. So yeah, it's a huge piece of the equation, is otherwise illegal or unregulated fishing.
The United Nations, we often talk on this program about a variety of groups, and the one agency that came to mind is the International Maritime Organization, a UN agency that brings the shipping companies of the world together to develop the rules and regulations to move ships safely. Though that seems so important to have all of these shipping companies, the Viking cruise lines and Holland Americas, not to pick on anybody, but just to name a few, to have them all involved and to see what they can do to pollute the oceans less. I mean, we all do that, obviously.
Yeah. In fact, that's one of the few verifiable success stories in the ocean protection kind of context is in shipping. So for example, the kind of frequency on a shipping mile kind of basis of big oil spills by ships has declined by something like 94% in the last 30 years through all kinds of very aggressive things like double hull ships and so forth. So number one, we had a very successful 17-year partnership with IMO on the issue of ships in their ballast water, the water that gives the ship stability, as a key vector for transferring invasive species all over the world. And this was something that was estimated to be costing the world $100 billion a year in cleanup. And
$100 billion,
a big deal.
For invasive species that come into your waters.
Yeah, such as the zebra mussel in the Great Lakes here in the US, but there's many other cases. And what we succeeded in doing with that project is helping, one thing, facilitate the ultimate negotiation, adoption, and coming into force of a new global convention, a new convention that has very strict requirements about what ships must do to both treat and manage their ballast water. And it came with a $35 billion price tag on the industry. But the good news is the industry is largely taking up installing these treatment systems that run $500,000 a pop into all the big container vessels, LNG vessels of the world. So that's a huge success, and we should see the overall global benefits of that intervention in the coming years. You'll see fewer invasions and so forth. So that's it. And then we're working even more recently with IMO on a new project called glow fouling, which deals with the other side of the ship invasive species risk issue, is the exterior of the ship, which can be fouled with organisms that grow, and they can be introduced into foreign ports and cause havoc in the same way. So that's looking at technological management and other solutions to keep ship hulls largely clean of fouling and reduce that problem. And that one has a double whammy, because not only, if you reduce hull fouling, not only do you reduce the risk of invasive species, you increase the efficiency of the ship, because a fouled ship has more friction, more drag, right? And that improves the carbon, reduces the carbon footprint of the ship. So this is also a very exciting area, which we're just starting new work with IMO on.
There are many things that can be done. And it shows we all have a role to play. It's very important. Well, what about we hear about the plastics floating around. I think, within 20 years, correct me if this is not right, within 20 years, the weight of the plastic in the oceans will weigh more than all the fish in the oceans, or something like, according to some of the scientists. Right. How serious is this plastic problem, and what is being done, or what can we do?
Right. It is quite serious. I mean, the best estimates are that something like 5 to 12 million metric tons of plastic are entering the ocean each year, in particular through some of the big, highly populated river basins, but also from large coastal centers, as you'd expect. Well, the fish versus plastic, that's one estimate, but it's actually a much simpler estimate. If you actually take the known number on the amount of plastic that is in the environment, that's either in waste in the environment or stuck in landfills, but of course a lot of that escapes, it already outweighs the human race by 10 to 1. Okay, you can worry about fish, that's one thing. There's already more plastic floating around the environment than human beings by a factor of 10 to 1, because it's about 7.5 billion tons against 7.5 billion humans at about an average 100 kilograms each. That's how the numbers work out. Anyway, in my personal view, this requires a real transformation in what we would call the plastics economy. And you hear a lot of talk about circular economy, and this is obviously where it's going. But I think one of the problems is you're talking a global issue. You go anywhere in the ocean, you're going to find plastics, from the deepest deep to the Arctic to everywhere. Number one, it's a huge multi-trillion-dollar global industry. The plastics, not only the resin producers, but then the organizations that make products and up the whole supply chain of plastic use. And so, take a good example: the Montreal Protocol to fight ozone, and the Vienna Convention to fight ozone depleting. That was a global issue, big global industry of the cooling, fluids. It was dealt with how? By a global solution that is a global convention. And so it's hard for me to back away from the idea that in the long, well, hopefully not too long run, we need a global legal framework on plastics to encourage, and not just encourage, to mandate the private sector to take much more responsibility in this issue. This is what's often called extended producer responsibility, that if they make the stuff, they're responsible for finding a way and covering the cost of that way to get it back to them for either reuse as a product or recycling and so forth. Otherwise, this problem is going to continue. There's lots of small things going on. They're good small things: single-use plastic bans, container deposit laws that incentivize consumers to bring back their plastics. But they're here and there. They're not comprehensive in a truly systemic kind of fashion. So I think we need a real big solution.
To be effective, it almost has to be universal.
It
has to cover the world, because but people all around the world are polluting in some way, shape, or form. Before we run out of time, let's talk about you were talking about the warming of the waters and that type of thing, acidification. We hear about the coral reefs and how they're under stress. The Great Barrier Reef comes to mind, one of probably the greatest coral reef in the world, I would imagine. What is the status of the reefs nowadays?
So it's a bit dire. I mean, the reefs are faced really with a whole sort of multiple injuries. You have warming, which causes what's known as coral bleaching. Even when water can warm, in some cases just a degree or two centigrade above sort of normal temperatures, the coral will expel their algae that are what's the word? They're co-species. I can't think of the right word, but they work together. The coral is an animal, and the algae is a plant, and they work together.
Like a host.
Yeah, a host kind of
relationship.
Symbiosis.
Symbiotic. Okay.
Right. And so and so with water worms, they'll get expelled. The coral die. They recover sometimes, but as it gets warmer, you're seeing more and more frequency of these instances, and that can lead to cases where the coral just cannot recover. So that's number one. Then you have, coastal issues of pollution, nitrogen being a key issue that can sort of just smother coral reefs with other kinds of algae and so forth that prevent their growth. And acidification. Coral reefs form their skeletons, the basis of their whole existence, from calcium carbonate they extract from the ocean. In a higher acidic ocean, that calcium carbonate eventually cannot form. That's the big threat of ocean acidification. Not only coral, but a lot of organisms, from mollusks to the smallest plankton, form their shells out of calcium carbonate. As it gets more and more acidic, it gets harder and harder and harder for them to do that.
Which is a dire problem. It certainly is.
And again, it all comes back to the Paris Agreement. If we can achieve Paris,
exactly,
or near achieve it, those kind of issues they won't be eliminated, but they will be greatly improve the chances for, in particular, recovery coral reefs.
Exactly, and all the countries of the world need to be involved.
Every single
The United States needs to go back into the Paris Agreement. It dropped out, or is in the process of dropping out, but we have to do this because we all have a part to play, and we're all going to suffer from it. And we can see that the Earth is deteriorating. Every scientific study has come up with more and more dire news that we need to focus on this, and we better do it very quickly because, as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said about a year or two ago, we only have about 12 to 15 years, if that, to get a handle on it. But Andy Hudson, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program. Thanks for being with me
Thank you,
today.
Bill, as well. Great to see you again.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.